You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The inevitable or merely a bump in the road, the prospects of a China-U.S. trade war in the eyes of a Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. The lowdown right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. You're still watching our program coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. After the Trump administration signed a memorandum targeting imports from China, concerns has been rife about a potential trade war between the world's two largest economies. But China and the U.S. are now in talks to discuss the matter, even though things could become tense at any moment. To weigh in on long-term relations between China and the U.S. and China's own reforms, I recently caught up with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, a Columbia University professor who's a Nobel laureate in economics. Before the interview, let's take a look at this.
China and the US are in talks to avoid a possible trade war, with both sides expressing optimism that a deal can be reached. The big three US markets rebounded Monday. The Dow closed nearly 670 points higher. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq closed higher too. Optimistic messages from both Washington and Beijing apparently easing investor fears.
China has always obeyed the rules of global trade, and we have always advocated equality and mutual benefit and settled the differences through dialogue. As a matter of fact, China and the United States have been negotiating. China is certain that it can safeguard its own interests.
President Donald Trump plans to slap tariffs on around $50 to $60 billion worth of Chinese goods. The administration says the plan is to reduce the trade deficit by roughly a third, a decrease of $100 billion this year. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang repeated pledges to ease access for American businesses to Chinese markets, and he said, with regard to trade imbalances, China and the United States should adopt a pragmatic and rational attitude, promote balancing through expansion of trade, and stick to negotiations to resolve differences and friction. Li says China would not force foreign firms to transfer their proprietary technologies and would strengthen intellectual property rights, two issues at the heart of U.S. complaints against China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is reportedly considering a visit to Beijing to advance the talks.
You are outspoken about the recent development between China and United States trade disputes. What are you exactly suggesting?
What I suggested a year ago when Trump got first elected and he promised to engage in strong trade, I said, you have to understand that Trump is a bully. You can't engage in appeasement. I also said that you ought to respond within the international rule of law, go to the WTO and file a case, because I believe that what the United States has done is not WTO compliant. I think China should take the high road and have the view of the long run. Most of us in the United States view Trump as a temporary phenomena. The question is, what is the long-term relationship between China and the United States? And that is what really needs to be the focus of discussion.
But the thing is, people only realize now that these are very important suggestions. Are we wasting our time? 1 year already?
No, I think it was not clear how Trump was going to proceed. He proceeded actually surprisingly slowly, but now in his second year, it appears he's much more aggressive. He's pushed away the more moderate voices inside the administration, surrounded him with hawks. What we also don't know is Whether the U.S. courts, how active they will be. A year ago, many of us had hoped that the Republicans would be able to tame President Trump.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen, even as he done some of the most outrageous things. They've not spoken out, and that's been, for me as an American, extremely disappointing. But our courts have responded. They've stopped the terrible things like the travel ban on Muslims entering into the United States. The question is whether Trump's actions in these areas are compliant with U.S. law. They're not compliant with the WTO law, but I think they're probably not compliant with U.S. law. We haven't yet seen that kind of legal action. I guess we'll just have to wait and see whether it happens.
It seems that the rest of the world is now being dragged down by the American politics. Everything seems to be now decided by what's happening within the domestic politics inside the United States, even about trade issues. So what would this mean for international economy, for the world's economy?
Well, I think it's really important for the international community to go ahead with, you might say, a WTO minus the United States. If it continues, meaning that the WTO will not be able to adjudicate cases in an effective manner. It seems to me we're coming to a crossroads.
Yeah.
And at this point, what needs to happen is the rest of the world has to come together and say, we believe in the international rule of law. It's important to have global governance, international rule of law. And those of us who are critical, we raise our voices to say we have to change this or that, but very strongly supportive of an international rule of law.
Yeah.
So that's what China's leadership could be very important. Working with Europe and other countries, let's get together and recognize if the United States is not going to be part of the international community, if it walks off from Paris, the rest of the world has to go ahead.
Yeah. The question is, there has been an agenda the world community should work on, and that agenda has been narrowed down by one country in various platforms intensively. So there seems to be very little things that people can work together to get, in a way, to save the system.
When Trump announced that he was going to leave Paris, within the United States there was a response. East Coast states, West Coast states said, Trump is not important. We're going to go ahead and more than meet the obligations of the United States. The rest of the world said, we're going to go ahead and meet the obligations because we know the survival of the planet is more important than Donald Trump. So that's an example where we did come together. I think the international community is going to have to decide, is the international rule of law in the area of trade important? And I think it is.
Professor Joseph Stiglitz suggesting that appeasement is not the way to deal with the Trump administration. Professor Stiglitz has been coming to China and communicating with the Chinese economic policymakers and business elites for more than 3 decades. Decades of observing China's market led him to point out that at this crossroad, China's next stage of reform is very important in shaping the country's own progress and even beyond. He also shares with me his own take on key words such as opening up and the market, which plays a decisive role. China also is committed to the reform and the opening up agenda. But the question is about speed. The question is also about the deep water reform, whether it's really committed. What are the messages you have collected over the days here in Beijing this time? And how strong is your impression about the further commitment and the speed of commitment?
Yeah, I've been coming to China for 37 years.
Exactly.
So I've seen almost the whole 40 years.
I say, Professor.
So I've certainly gotten a message that the government is very much committed to the next stage of reform, that just as in the past, it did it in a very deliberate way. It was called gradualism, but at certain critical moments, things move very fast. And it's that combination of gradualism and speed. And I think we're again at a critical moment here. So there's a lot of commitment about opening, and I think that's good. But I think at the same time, that opening has to be done in the right way.
What is the right way you're talking about?
Sometimes the term opening up is misinterpreted to mean getting the government out of the way. And I think that is the wrong view. Opening up, it means creating more markets, but making sure markets behave like markets, competitive, not taking advantage of others, not exploiting those who are less informed.
Right.
So it's actually trying to make market economies behave like markets are supposed to, and realizing the limits on markets.
The 19th Party Congress and the just concluded the two sessions, MPC and CPPCC, have been talking about the ultimate leadership of the Chinese Communist Party of this country, and that has been reaffirmed into the Chinese Constitution. But at the same time, the third session of the 18th Party Congress has decided, and that spirit has been carried on, about market play a decisive role. So many around the world are wondering, how will these concepts be able to interact and work together? Professor, I want to borrow your wisdom on that as well.
Well, I think the notion of having markets play a decisive role means that markets are an important instrument. But markets have to be shaped. They don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be regulated. Markets are not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end. And what those broader objectives are, what are the societal objectives, is what is being referred to in the view of where the party is taking society. It's really what I interpret it to be, what is the vision of China's society.
How do you think China will be able to streamline its own necessity to reform within the country and the outside pressure or the outside push? How does that work? What is kind of chemistry?
China is in a very different position today than it was 40 years ago or even 20 years ago
Absolutely.
or 15 years ago. So it seems to me important for China to decide for itself where it wants to go. It should recognize that most of the business community is actually supportive of the broad opening up of China and is not with President Trump. So President Trump represents a minority in the Republican Party, which is actually a minority in the United States. So the point I want to emphasize is it doesn't even reflect where American society is, although there are many, many concerns.
But it is the government now, Professor, that is deciding on the policies. That is just a fact and the reality.
Yeah, so the point I want to make is that it should be the government keeping its eye on what they think is best for China, aware that there's an external environment, aware that it's a big global economy. Most of the people in Europe don't agree with what President Trump is doing. Most of the people in Latin America don't agree. Most of the people in Africa don't agree. There are only a couple countries where Trump has very much support. So the basic thing is China has to keep its eye on the long run, not on the current noise coming out of Washington. And
go beyond the noise. Look through the noise.
Look through the noise. I think it's very important not to do anything which is inconsistent with what China believes is its long-run view of its development.
Whether, when we say the consensus is strong enough in the rest of the world vis-a-vis what you called a minority of Americans or of American politicians? That we don't know. Secondly, the current international system has been built upon the result of the Second World War, in which the United States took a leadership role. Now, both of these two factors have been evolving. It's very fluid right now. But we do not know whether the alternative is strong enough. And among the alternatives, there is any common consensus. That's what we don't know. And that is really dragging us to this despair and also, shall I say, concerns about disaster in the near future.
Yeah, I don't think there's a risk of disaster. I don't think there should be despair. I think...
You're always an optimistic person. I learned through years, Professor.
So I think, as I say, there are good relations with Europe. They could get even better because Europe also is going to have a lot of problems with the United States. So the rest of the world is having problems with the United States. So this is a moment where China could strengthen its relationship with other countries. It's already having this Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, which is bringing it closer to a very large fraction of the world. So it is managing its external relations, but at the same time, because China is at a different stage of development and was already moving towards more domestically driven demand, away from export-driven demand, this is just going to be an impetus for moving that domestically driven demand even faster. So I think that actually China is poised for absorbing any shock that comes from Washington in the next few months.
China is well poised to endure any kind of shock coming from Washington. That is coming from Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate for economics. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel and also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.